Okay, welcome back to the Applied Leadership Podcast. My name is Brandon Young. As always, I'm joined by my good friend and business partner, Blaine Smith, and we are really excited today to have a plus one, our friend Jan Rutherford, former Green Beret, founder of Self-Reliant Leadership, where Jan coaches executives and leads Crucibles, which are wilderness expeditions with executives and veterans. Jan has over 25 years of business experience and has held executive roles in business development, marketing, sales, training, product management, CEO. Basically, you name it, Jan has done it. And, in addition to the fact that Jan has done all these amazing things, he has been a wonderful friend to Blaine and I, been instrumental in us getting our business up off the ground, being a guy who's just gone out there, led the way, shown us how a couple of old barrel-chested freedom fighters like us can maybe get into the world of translating some of that leadership out into the private sector. And one thing that we are really excited to share about Jan is that he actually has a new book out on the market. It is in pre-order right now. We will make sure that we drop that link down in the notes. It's called Becoming a Self-Reliant Leader, and it is a practical guide that explores each step of the Crucible journey and how its lessons can be applied to today's leadership challenges. Jan, I could talk about you for the rest of the episode, but I just want to say welcome. Thanks for being here with us today, and we're really excited about the book coming up.
Thanks, Brandon, and thanks, Blaine. And I should mention, I said at the beginning, our co-author was led by Blaine Smith at West Point when Blaine was what's called a firstie, a senior, and Jacquie Jordan was a plebe. So he role modeled things that I'm sure made it into the book. So you guys are in there some way, somehow.
Jen, I appreciate you saying that. I suspect it's a stretch, but nonetheless, I accept your compliment.
Yeah. Well, good.
Well, let's get into the meat of it.
All right.
Same old, same old. We're going to throw a question out there, and this time, instead of just two dudes chopping it up, we got three dudes chopping it up here. And I'm just going to say from the top, I've never felt so covered as being between two Green Berets. So I'm in good shape here. I don't even care what happens now. This is going to be great. Hit it, Blaine.
Yeah, I think we'll have plenty to talk about for sure. And I'm going to resist the urge to sort of interview Jan here as our guest and toss a question out for the three of us to bat around. It's a good question that came in, and it's really all about humility. So the question is, how do you balance pride and humility? Which is a huge, broad question and a serious one. And the context is, this is coming from the person asking the question. Sometimes when I'm starting to have success and my confidence is building, I can feel myself perhaps crossing the line onto the negative side of pride. And that is something I'm sure we've all wrestled with from time to time, especially folks like you that are listening to this, that I'm sure are out there attempting hard things and have had some failures, but have probably also had some wins and have done some impressive things. How do we balance our desire for humility with our desire for confidence and ultimately success? So that is the question. I will toss it maybe over to you, Jan, first. We'd love to hear your thoughts as our guest. We'll give you the floor. And what do you think about that?
I mean, I say often pride and ego. I use both, not just pride. And what was interesting, we had a behavioral psychologist out on a Crucible about a year ago who was active duty. He's getting ready to take command of JSOC, Joint Special Operations Command. So he came out not because he was transitioning out. He came out because he wanted to see what we were doing and be able to apply some of those lessons. And one of the things he threw out was, when does ego serve? When does it get in the way? Ego is in confidence. And it was a really good discussion that we had, around the fire. And I think about that a lot. I mean, like so many things in leadership, it requires a balance: task and relationship, strategic and tactical, confidence, pride, and humility. And the only way that you can have a balance, sort of, is high self-awareness. And how do you not only know your proclivity, but its effect on other people? And that's the thing that I think gets lost. Oftentimes we'll say, well, I'm gruff, or I'm not a great listener, or I'm this, or I'm that. But we don't stop to think, well, how does that affect other people, both positively and negatively? And do I have the wherewithal to control my emotional response that delivers what's best for the team, not that satisfies my pride and ego? And I'll tell you just a real quick story, and I'll throw it back to you guys. We had an executive on a Crucible in Moab, and we got to a part that was some exposure. There's like a little cliff, and the perceived risk was much higher than the real risk. But she decided, I'm done. I'm not going any further. And we told everybody all along, hey, if there's ever something you don't feel safe doing, we'll figure something out. And I was worried when she said, I'm not going any further, that it would ruin the trip for her, that she would later feel bad, like, oh, I could have done it, I should have done it. Not the case. We reverse track. We came up with an alternative route, and I talked to her and I said, how you doing? She goes, great. And it was interesting because what I observed is she had so much confidence that she could be vulnerable. And because she could be vulnerable, it fed into her confidence. It was like this superpower, like a perpetual machine. And of all the people we've ever had on the Crucible, she was the least experienced when it came to the wilderness. I mean, all new REI stuff. But
Bring the moleskin.
But she commanded respect. I mean, it did not deter at all. And she usually was the last one to speak. And she spoke with such gravitas and command. It was unbelievable. And so, again, I think that the superpower was, these two things, but I think it was she really understood her effect on other people to a degree that most people don't.
I love the humility, the willingness to say, I am not comfortable proceeding at this juncture, and yet also the willingness to kind of backtrack, find another way around, and be right on target, right with everybody else. I mean, that is true humility right there, and expressed in vulnerability, in a courageous act to raise your hand and say, I'm not comfortable here.
Yeah.
With
some expletives.
Yeah.
She was not shy about letting people know where she stood.
Yeah.
It of the 25, 24 Crucibles we've done, that incident is one of the most memorable of everything out there, because I really thought the trip was ruined. Not because we didn't go this route. I thought she would just feel bad, but she just had such command, and she said, I am not comfortable. I could die. And we talked about it. And I remember actually saying, hey, before we turn around, all right, I understand that you see this as a risk you're not willing to take. And I said, before we turn around, talk to me about the risks you ask people to take, and where they might be scared to death. It's not a cliff, but they're afraid to do something, and you're pushing them. And she, we spent about 5-10 minutes just kind of reflecting on that. And that was kind of cool that she said, I really need to understand where people feel, nervous or afraid or not confident or whatever it is. And that, and that they were willing to voice concerns to her, because she was a really strong personality. I mean, I could see people not wanting to tell her what she didn't want to hear. What's coming to your mind on this? Because you had this tossed over, and I'm sure you've dealt with it. Pride and humility, and those getting out of whack.
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, I'm excited with the fact that we've been given a question about pride, and we have immediately gone to humility, which is a force multiplier. I think we've seen that in a number of leadership contexts, the humility that you can demonstrate to others. And I don't think that humility is mutually exclusive with pride or being proud in your abilities. In fact, I would say, for me, when I think of pride, I think of a couple of things. I think of pride of effort, pride of ownership. I think of being proud of the work that I put out into the world, and really investing and making sure that I can be proud of something. I think we all think about that as writers, as as educators, as speakers, coaches, is you want to be thoughtful. You want to be proud of what you're putting out there into the world. And I think that there's this unique difference that crosses the line. And I would say that unique difference is going from being proud to being prideful. And I think that, it's when we start to behave or operate out of that pridefulness, that's where I think that we lose humility, and why I think that, pride and humility are not mutually exclusive. But I wonder if it's that overexpression becomes prideful, that overexpression becomes what many of us would probably say is cockiness. You've now gone from being confident to being cocky. That's the external manner in which you show up. And the sad part about it is that you may have an awful lot to offer, but you're really just going to lose the team. You're going to lose people if we go so far into that cockiness and don't just rest in being proud of who we are, proud of the work that we've done, proud of the experiences and what we can bring to the table, and we operate out of that pridefulness. And that's where I think, the old proverb, pride goes before the fall. I think it's kind of talking a little bit more about that pridefulness, that operating out of hubris. Whereas the reason I love where we started here with that story in the Crucible is because you come back to that leader and you ask, how you doing? She's, I'm good. I'm solid. This is probably somebody who has a lot of pride in their leadership, pride in how they show up in the world. But I would say a prideful response would have been to act in hubris and say, oh no, I'm fine. There's nothing wrong with this. While inside they're kind of shaking because they're not fine. They're not okay. And I think that it is strength in leadership to tell the truth, tell people where you're at, hey, I'm kind of scared. I'm not super jazzed about this. I could use a little bit of help. And I think that shows not only maturity, but, being proud of your team as well, because you're looking for your team to help you. I mean, that's where my brain initially goes. Blaine, I don't know what you think about it, but that's where I'm thinking.
Yeah, I love everything said so far. I might just tack on to some of what you said. I love this idea of confidence. And we've talked about a little about authenticity, which is a bit of a silver dollar word at the moment. But as I've talked to a lot of people about authenticity and how that relates to humility and even pride, one of the little litmus tests maybe that I use is the word embarrassment. And this is something that I've had to think a lot about for me personally. And here's what I mean. I think in the case that, Jan, in the story you told, there was a person who was willing to speak up, tell the truth about where they were at, and do it in a way that didn't necessarily embarrass them or break them and allowed them to carry forward. So that is showing up authentically, right? You're speaking the truth. You're telling people where you're at. You're being who you are, and you're doing it without that ruining your day or making you feel embarrassed or not worthy. So I think that's a great example of authenticity. Now, I think the other side of the coin that a lot of leaders might need to hear is what Brandon spoke to, which is you can be totally confident in something. You can be proud of your effort, proud of what you're doing, proud of the product you're selling. And you can do that in a way that is authentic, meaning you're not embarrassed about the fact that you're really good at this or you have something smart to say about this. And I think I've personally struggled with that a lot of times in my life. I often get very embarrassed or chagrined at public praise because I worry about people thinking or saying a certain thing about me or getting too big for my britches and things like that. And I think a lot of leaders out there could actually deal with a healthy dose of authenticity with regard to actually being good at something, displaying confidence and saying, no, I've done the work here and I know what I'm talking about. So I think that's the balance, the sort of Aristotle golden mean kind of thing we're talking about, where the virtue lay between the two vices or the deficiency and the excess. It has a lot to do with authenticity and being willing to show up and say either, hey, I'm not sure about this. Let me think about it some more. Or I have thought about this a lot. I feel pretty good about my position on this. Here's what I think. Both of those are perfectly fine if that's really where you're at. And so I think the way that you stay out of kind of that prideful trap that you're talking about, Brandon, is where is it really coming from? Number one, is it coming from a place of real confidence or from a place of ego and kind of you're feigning it? And the second piece, Jan, you mentioned is for whom, for what? Is it in service of the team? Is it in service of the mission? If so, probably good to go. If it's in service of the ego or your reputation or your persona, probably not. So those are the two things I would ask is, where is it really coming from? And then for who?
You mentioned authenticity, and I think the really hard thing is, of course, we want people to be authentic. Of course we do. I mean, if they're not, you can see through that. Yet, you've got to deliver what's best for the team. And that's the balance. I mean, Ronald Reagan said a long time ago, I don't know how you could be president if you didn't know how to act, perform. There is a performative aspect to leadership. And I know we don't like to talk about it, but it's true. If I'm authentic all the time, I'm going to be, that's a big excuse for being a jerk, and it's like, well, I'm just being authentic. Well, sometimes you got to throttle that back and say, what's best for the team? I think my hypothesis is all the bad behaviors we see are basically rooted in insecurities, which we all have. And I think the more insecurities, the more somebody shows up as a bully or, kind of a jerk at work. And so, we have to remember that. And again, we've got our own, your insecurity, Blaine, about, wanting, not wanting that praise and kind of being embarrassed. But I've coached a lot of people with executive presence. And the research I've done on it basically comes down to this. Your appearance. Yep, sorry, your appearance matters. 2, the way you communicate. And 3, gravitas, or what we would call swagger. Well, you need swagger, but you don't need to be arrogant. And so you've got to, modulate that. And, the best advice I ever got when I started doing this line of work was from a retired 2-star. And he knew I was getting ready to teach MBA students at the University of Colorado. And he was across the table from me at dinner, and he grabbed my forearm and he held it. And he goes, so you're going to teach leadership, huh, Jan? I said, yep, bud, I am. And he goes, are you ready to face your own hypocrisy? And, I think about that every time I take the stage, every time I do a workshop. I think about it when I'm giving advice. I think about it all the time is, gosh, so much of what I preach are things that I did wrong or screwed up before, and I've learned from it. The wisdom comes from all the mistakes, but I'm always cognizant that, we are all a work in progress.
I like swagger. I wrote down when you were talking about confidence earlier that the people, and we all know them, there are people we know that have a certain gravitas, that have a certain swagger, that are quite quiet. The people who have the true confidence to speak last, those who have the willingness to say, I'm not sure about that, let me think about it. Those people have real swagger. Those people have gravitas because they're demonstrating a level of confidence to say, I don't need to prove to you or anybody else in this moment that I know something I don't know, or that I'm good at something that I'm actually not good at. I'm going to be thoughtful. I'm going to let the chips fall where they may here in this conversation, and I will chime in when I have something important to say. Those people have swagger, and the inverse of that we've all seen too, right? People who are chiming in when they don't really have anything to add, just speaking to be on the record as, I'm in the meeting minutes of having said something. Yeah. The external assessment of that is typically an eye roll.
I remember being a young squad leader. I was in my first year of being a squad leader, and I remember my platoon sergeant pulling me aside after one of our meetings. All 4 squad leaders, the platoon leader, the platoon sergeant, kind of handling platoon business and whatnot, and saying, "Hey, do you notice that whenever John starts talking, everybody stops and listens?" I said, "Yes, I do." He said, "Try doing that a little bit." John was always a quiet guy, a very good friend of mine, John. He's always a quiet guy, often spoke last, and I am not very quiet. I've always been a very, very loud person or very talkative. My mother used to always beg me, "Brandon, would you just please keep your mouth shut?" because I would get in trouble all the time at school. But I love how you said about operating out of our insecurities, Jan, because, I was a young squad leader. I was intimidated. I was insecure. I wanted to be great. I wanted to be seen as competent, just like all the rest of these leaders, some of the guys that I had looked up to and gotten promoted into the room. But, I had to learn that the hard way, right? I had to learn to be quiet a little bit and try to speak last, or at least maybe second or third from last, but certainly not first.
I got that advice too, Brandon, at early in my career. And the word that somebody used that resonates to this day is they said, Jan, you need to be more measured. And I've tried to coach that with people. It's a little bit of knowing, you can't die on every hill.
Yeah.
You got to know when to speak up, how to create an alliance, how to get things done, when's the right time. I mean, all that political, social awareness, that measured. And part of it is a certain level of maturity, both personal and professional. And I don't know if you all have coached that before, where this measured executive presence. I mean, a lot of that is kind of what we're getting at. All these different things, from a leadership perspective, you've got to balance, and you have to have the awareness to know, oh, I've tilted over here. I've got to come back over. You can't rely on other people, because the higher up you go, they're not going to tell you. So you've got to figure out, how do I develop more self-awareness to know my effect on other people?
Or the cues will be much more subtle, at least, right? They might not tell you, but there'll be signs that you need to be paying attention for.
No, this is really important, Jan. We have a module on executive presence, and at the core of the module, we talk about the intersection of credibility and relatability. Essentially, that you have to actually have the credibility. Do you have the experience? Do you have the command of the subject? Do you know what you're talking about? Can you show that you have demonstrated some of that? And then the relatability, and how can you relate that to the setting by which you are operating? And then that doesn't mean that as a leader you can't go from one sector to another sector, or one position to another position, any of those things. In the credibility aspect of things, but we find a lot that it is that relatability, and I think that comes so much down to that core of self-awareness. Are you aware of the manner in which your words are impacting? Is your message sent the message that is received? Because I think a lot of times that lack of awareness generates that lack of relatability, because sometimes people can just be seen as like, oh, well, goodness gracious, they're just so advanced. They've done this so much. There's no possible way this can relate to me. They're like a wizard. I don't know how they do it, but they just do it. And that's not what we're looking for at all. I think that jumps into the pridefulness, maybe. That jumps into, crossing that line as our, the person who has asked this question of us. I think it can jump into that. I mean, maybe that's a watchword that we can look for, is relatability. How is this relating to the people that I'm actually speaking to? And Blaine and I talk about that a lot. We think about that an awful lot. We tell stories from our time as special operators quite frequently, and we don't do that to encourage people to become special operators. We do it so that we can open a new window into an old truth, so that they can actually get the nugget of wisdom out of that and help lead more effectively for the long haul. And I don't know, maybe that's one of the kind of watchwords we can look for here when we start to dip into pridefulness, which is that relatability, Blaine.
I like that a lot. And the special ops reference makes me think about the phrase that was screamed at me all the time, which was, it's not about you. And what I was just noting down while you guys were talking there is that whether it's executive presence or credibility or pride and humility, it really does in many ways come down to the individual's ability to be aware of themselves and how it is impacting others. It really is about others. And when we teach executive presence, one of the first things we say, Brandon, is people tend to think this is about me and how I posture myself, but it really is about how do you relate to others and how do they feel when you are around. That's what presence is rooted in. And I was just thinking here that, a lot of leadership is about discomfort. It's about a willingness and an ability to absorb things that are uncomfortable in the spirit of supporting the team. And I think if we go back to thinking about pride and humility, or on this axis of deficiency and excess, I would say this. I would say the difference between being proud and prideful is when you're proud, you're doing what needs to be done for the good of the group. When you are prideful, you are doing what serves you, often to the detriment of the group, right? We see this all the time when CEOs are about to be ousted or something, right? They're just trying to save face and they're acting in a way that doesn't serve the company or whatever. Same with humility, by the way. On the other side of the coin, I would say, being humble is being aware of what you don't know and stepping back for the good of the group from time to time. But not being willing to chip in, to weigh in, to do something because you're afraid of being embarrassed or stepping on someone's toes or whatever, that's not humility. That's just sort of lack of confidence, or it's a self-protective measure. Sometimes you have to absorb the discomfort of raising your hand, throwing a flag, inserting yourself, and being confident, again, for the good of the group. So I think you can definitely err on either side. You can act prideful in a way that harms the group. You can also act you can shrink away in a way that harms the group. And so I think what it always comes down to is what is best for the people that I'm involved with, for my team, for those that I'm leading. And there will be times when I need to be more assertive and more confident. And there will be times when I need to pull back a bit.
I think when I think about it, I think proud is how you feel. I'm proud. Prideful is how you act.
Ooh.
And this all boils down to I always think of leading self, leading others, leading the organization. If we go to the highest level and we say, hey, we've got some people being prideful and people not being humble, and we have to look at the organization and say, do we have trust here? Ultimately, do we have trust where people can speak up and they can debate and then they can come to commitments and, accountability and results? But I think, there's leadership coaching of these things and coaching of oneself. But at the highest level, at the C-suite, at the C level, the founder, they've got to look at and say, is there a pattern of behavior here? And what have been the consequences for that behavior? So often in the last few weeks, I've seen people complain about, individuals. And we had somebody on our podcast recently who reminded us, your culture becomes the worst behavior you tolerate. And I'll often ask, well, what have been the incentives for these behaviors? Not money. What's gotten praise? And I'll give you an example. And this ties into pride. There's, and we saw this in the military. There are projects, and they're behind, over budget, behind time, timelines. Mm-hmm. And then somebody will come in and they will save the day. They will work 14 hours a day. They will leave their family and go live somewhere else for 2 or 3 weeks to fix the project. And you know what? They are rewarded as heroes. And you think, well, what's wrong with that? They saved the day. Like, as you and I know, people become heroes when the team goes to crap. If the team succeeds in the mission, there's no heroes. We don't need to reward heroes in the business world. When we do that, we're incenting the wrong behavior. The team fell apart. And so, as leaders, if you're in the trenches all the time with blinders on, you don't see these things, and you can't correct it through structure and people and incentives and processes and systems. And so, that's the other thing I would throw out there. Is this a systemic problem? And it's not just, hey, I need to go fix individuals, because we know that that's sort of a brute force thing you've got to do. And it can be emotionally exhausting. We might be incenting the wrong stuff.
Yeah, Jan, I really like that. Follow the incentives always and pay attention. Brandon and I have talked a little bit about the drama triangle in family systems theory, and how if you've got a hero, you almost necessarily have a victim and a villain. And a lot of people will say, well, it's better to be the hero because I don't want to be a victim or a villain. And what we always respond with is, you got to get off the triangle. Yeah. You don't want to be on the triangle.
You got to reject yourself.
Everybody becomes a victim in the drama triangle.
Yeah, that's right.
Ultimately.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's 100% right.
Yeah. It's funny. I think when I think of team, leading others, I always think of the drama triangle, as a systemic problem. When I think of leading the organization, oftentimes people mix up the importance of team one versus team two. The team they're on being really important versus the team they lead. Those things get mixed up too. And again, a lot of times it's pride and ego. I hired
Yeah.
these people, I trained them, they respect me. And it's like, well, yeah, but you have no power and influence in the organization. You can't do
Yeah.
anything for your people because
Yeah.
you can't get along with your peers. You have no say so over your boss.
Yeah.
You can't throttle them back.
Well, you're really talking. You're really starting to descend into the particulars about something I'm very excited because you mentioned it a couple moments ago, which was trust. You're really talking about trust here, and you're really talking about a lack of trust. You talk about these environments where you say like, oh, we've got all these individuals, and oftentimes Blaine and I hear that manifested as like, could you just like execute? Could you just do the thing that you're supposed to do, that you're supposed to say you're supposed to do the thing, like stop being an individual. And we often find that that's really that cry for just some execution and a little bit of follow through is often a proxy for can I just trust you? Can I just trust you to do the right darn thing? And you want to talk about a trust killer? Prideful behavior is a trust killer. That is a great way to really shatter trust within an organization. And we think authenticity is really important. You mentioned that earlier here, and you mentioned authenticity, like I would suggest that authenticity doesn't give anybody a license to be a jerk. If you're being a jerk, then well, you're just being a jerk. That's probably rooted in some of those insecurities or some of those hurts that you have, those wounds. You're probably operating out of your wounds instead of your scars. If you're somebody who sees clear things and wants to make improvements, there's ways to communicate that authentically without being a jerk. But I bring authenticity back up because authenticity, we feel, is such a critical piece of that recipe for establishing trust. And oftentimes when people are operating out of that pridefulness, they're not really operating from, a place of authenticity in many ways. And Blaine, you mentioned this earlier too, and I am glad I wanted to circle back to this because you talked about the role of humility as well. And you walked that a little bit on an axis. And I would even say that false humility is a bit of a sign of pridefulness. It's a bit of a sign of that hurt because it's almost like it's the fishing. I'm fishing for a compliment. Stop it with the false humility. If you're good at something, be proud of that, settle into that, and it probably can benefit the entire team. But if you're fishing for compliments with that false humility, you're probably operating out of pridefulness and you're thinking more about what's in it for me or what's best for me, not what's best for the team.
I know. I look guilty all the time of that one. So I appreciate you bringing it up. I won't go into specifics, but before we started recording, Jan mentioned something to me that made me feel very uncomfortable. And I'm fighting all my natural instincts. And Jan, if you remember, what I finally said was, I accept your compliment, right? Because it was every fiber of my being wanted to reject that and be falsely modest in some ways, at least, because that was something that made me feel uncomfortable that somebody had said about me that was, nice, frankly.
I want to stay on this. I actually want to lean into this because I think we will do well, not only in the conversation, but for our friend who asked the question, because, so is it okay to be proud? Can we be proud or should we be afraid of that? Right.
I have some thoughts on this. I'm ready to go whenever you are.
I threw it out there. Take it.
Okay. So Jan, you said something a while ago that really struck me. And I think for me, at least, this facilitates the answer to this question. You said being proud is a feeling and being prideful is a behavior. And what just jumped into my head, and I think will be very helpful for me going forward, is that I was taught back when I was in special forces training that if you overplay a strength, it can become a weakness. So a lot of things fall on this golden mean. You want to stay in the middle. You want to be decisive, but not rash. That was an example that was given to me. And I was like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. It really woke me up to some things. And I was like, okay, it helped me a lot as a leader. But that's kind of a behavioral thing. And where I'm coming to at the moment is, I think on the behavioral stuff, there probably is a healthy median or mean for a lot of this stuff. You want to be not deficient or in excess with the way you act around some of these things. However, I think when it comes to how you feel, I'm not sure that you need to throttle yourself. So to go back to our listener, I would be careful to advise somebody to say, hey, be careful. Don't get too confident or don't be too proud of yourself, because maybe you shouldn't artificially throttle that. If you are continuing to work at something and you're continuing to get better at it and you're continuing to have more experience with it, I don't see any reason why you should not continue to become more confident and more proud of that effort. And right, I think you could continue to feel more and more of that without having to put a lid on it necessarily. The behavior, however, I think is the one that you want to watch out for a little bit, as it relates to others and how your behaviors, the words you say, the actions you take, how often you jump in and fix things, etc., affects those around you. So I might create a little bit of a split there and say, behavior, yes, let's keep it in the middle. How you feel, look, if you continue to build confidence and feel more proud of what you're doing, don't feel like you're not allowed to feel that, because you've probably earned it if that's the case.
A lot of we all come from the military, and we know one of the ways that people gain confidence is by becoming highly competent. Most people that report to them in the military, they've done their jobs. In the business world, that's not the case. I mean, I've never been a CIO, I've never been a CFO, I've never been a chief counsel, and yet I was a CEO in charge of all these people. And so the confidence has to come from somewhere else besides competence. And again, I think it comes from humility, by asking the dumb questions, saying, I don't know, I don't understand. I used to tell my CIO all the time, I'd say, David, stop, just stop, draw a picture in black, and then with a red pen, show me where the problem is. And then I will understand the system. Because I don't know the words, I don't know what you speak of. I could call BS on sales and marketing and biz dev all day long, but I couldn't on IT. Yeah. And part of that humility, going back to trust, Brandon, is you got to give trust to get trust. And it's not just about being vulnerable and doing what you say you're going to do. You have to give trust. And you know what? People are people, and they are going to disappoint you, and they're going to let you down, and they're going to frustrate you.
Yeah.
And as a leader, you've got to figure out, how do you lead when people do that? The hero would basically go out and try to fix everything and do it him or herself. And that's not the thing. Leaders basically see these opportunities when people screw up, fail, missteps, and look at those as growth opportunities. And part of that, the really hard part, is managing expectations above, saying, hey, board, hey, CEO, we're not going to be able to deliver 20% return this quarter. I'm dealing with some infrastructure stuff, people development. I can deliver this, but we've got some things we've got to fix. If you have no power and influence, you're constantly saying, oh, we got to do 20%, and you just constantly are beating people up. And that doesn't work over the long haul. And honestly, that's what I'm seeing going on in our markets right now. There's this coming down from the top, and nobody's pushing back saying, wait a minute, I can deliver this, but not in this time frame. And again, that humility and that confidence isn't just for subordinates. It's really managing up as well.
Yeah. I like that a lot. I just thought, as you were talking there, Jan, that we have to give trust. We get to give grace, because people are going to disappoint us. It's going to happen.
That word. It's funny, Brandon, of all the people I've ever interviewed, the only people that have ever brought up grace besides you just now have been women leaders. I never hear men use that word grace. And I think we men could learn a lot from that. I think that's a superpower if you can give grace.
Yeah, I think so. I'm curious. We're kind of rounding our time out here, but I just wonder. I think, Blaine, you've already given us a thought on what we can be watchful for if we're that leader out there. So our friend has asked us this question: how will I know when I'm going from pride or being proud to kind of dipping too far over the line into pridefulness? I think you gave us a good hint there, which was, if I'm operating in a manner that is of benefit to me and I'm not thinking about benefit to others, that might be one of the things that we could kind of look out for. What are some other things that we could look out for on our mental dashboard here, so that we, what are our warning tracks that we can be on the look for here, guys? I would say, I'll kind of throw this out there as a thought, is checking impact, checking for impact, right? Checking the response, the reaction. Like check for tone here, check for impact. What's happening on the back end of this, right? And sometimes we talk about this with other leaders that we are advising, which is, not only are you going to want to check for signs of unsettling or check for signs of disengagement by the absence of the normal, which is often missed, but the presence of what is abnormal. So we talk about it all the time. You might have one of those people who they're always talking to you. You're always in a good dialogue with them. You have great one-on-ones. We're checking on progress here, and then all of a sudden they go dark on you. You just, how's everything going? It's fine. Were you able to work through those issues on that project? Yep. Nothing? What are you seeing on your end? That's a sign of disengagement here. That might be a sign that something that we're doing is kind of hitting in a negative way. It may be showing them that, gosh, I don't really feel safe right now. I don't feel safe to get to the edge of that canyon and raise my hand and say, like, hey, I'm not going this way. This isn't safe for me. I don't feel good about this. So maybe absence of the normal or the presence of the abnormal in behavioral patterns, maybe that's a sign that how I'm showing up with my team might be going over the line of being someone who's proud or having that competence, and is kind of like blowing that bridge of relatability or connection because I'm being too prideful.
Sure. I've got one. I would call this like domain transfer, or sort of unrelated domain transfer. Here's what I mean by this. When we get really good at one thing, or we get known for being really good at one thing, or we get accolades for one thing, we sometimes can tend to think that we're good at other things that we're not good at, or that our opinion really matters on things that are in a totally different domain than when we earned our credibility in the first place. So you could see this in business. Jan actually gave a great example. He's the CEO. He knows a lot about business development, sales, and marketing, doesn't know anything about technology. You could see a CEO, because they're the CEO and they've been good at one, or maybe they're good at operations and good at sales and marketing. They may, weigh in unnecessarily or in ways that are not helpful in domains or areas of the business where they actually don't have expertise, right? I think we see this a lot with like billionaires, people who make a lot of money and gain a lot of prominence through, being a tech entrepreneur or being an artist. What they've done and what they've earned is amazing, and they should get all credit for that. But I don't know that I want to take cues from them around child rearing or social justice or some of these other things, right? And I think that is a mistake that we can really make. And we're definitely being prideful, I think, when we start weighing in on things or thinking we have a lot of smart things to say in domains that fall outside of our expertise, because we've had so much success, perhaps, in our primary domain.
Oh, I love that. That's, here's an inside voice to QE on that. Everyone should listen to what I have to say here. Why? Red flag. No, they should not. All right. Well, that's my thought, at least.
All right. Well, maybe this is a good place for us to land the plane here. We've covered an awful lot of ground. The original question was, how do I know when I'm having success and my confidence may be drifting onto the negative side of pride? And I think a lot of what we've done is to try to parse that out. So maybe my kind of closing thought for this would be, it's totally okay to be proud. If you've earned it, we want you to be, and we don't want you to shrink from that, because that's not doing anybody any good either. If you're good at something and you're proud of the work you've done, if you're proud of the product you're selling, if you're proud of your effort, lean into that, even if it feels a little comfortable for you at times. That's a feeling, and it's okay to turn that thing up to 11 if it's justified. Being prideful is maybe more of a behavior, and that may be indicated by it's no longer relating well with others. It's getting in the way of the team. It's in service of you versus the whole. Or maybe you're drifting into pretending you know a lot about things that you don't really know a lot about. And if you start seeing those indicators, then maybe it's time to pull back and assess a little bit. With that, Jan, I want to send it over to you, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but you're our guest, and I'd love for you to kind of have the last word. Is there anything that you want to leave with the folks that are listening? Anything about the work you're working on, or just thoughts you have for leaders out there that are doing their best in jobs that are undoubtedly very hard?
Well, I think leadership has never been harder. I mean, it is really hard. And I think what leadership calls for in this day and age is something that's sort of contradictory. I think we need a personalized approach, yet we need to be perceived as fair. And I'll explain. If you went to the doctor and you said, I got this cough, and they said, go in this room and there's 40 other people in there coughing. And then the doctor walks in and he goes, everybody's getting amoxicillin 4 times a day, 10 days. See you later. You would be really frustrated. Like, I'm being treated like everybody else. I'm unique. I think that's where we're at. And, is this a lot more work? Absolutely. But we know Gallup just released their results. 23% of the world is engaged at work, 33% in the United States. 1 out of 3 people are engaged at work. And it's trillions of dollars of lost productivity because people aren't engaged. Well, guess what, leader? You've got to change. You've got to adapt what you're doing. You can't do the Red Army approach and walk in a room and tell everybody the same thing in the same way at the same time and think that's expedient. It just does not work. You've got to know what motivates people, what drives them, what their fears are. And you've got to talk to them and communicate and help. And here's the other thing, and I'm really big on expectations, but in this day and age, you've got to be open to negotiating. You might say, hey, these are the 5 things you got to do. And they're saying, well, I want to do 3 of those, but I have this pet project over here. And you've got to decide, use your judgment. Hey, do I let this person do a pet project that doesn't really, I don't think is helpful, but it keeps them engaged, keeps them in the game. And again, how do you do that if you're in a big company where everything's mandated? Well, you've got to have power and influence with the powers that be. And, read Jeff Pfeffer's book on the 7 rules of power. And trust me, you won't like all of what he says, but it's all evidence-based. And I think that's where we're at. And again, if you're a leader, you get to be a leader. You get this awesome responsibility to help improve lives. And when I think about what I do, ultimately, do I coach? Yeah. Do I speak? Yeah. But ultimately, what I'm trying to do is get people to go home at night and be good tired, and their teams to be good tired, not bad tired. Too many people are bad tired at the end of the day. And again, I think we've got to adapt. We've got to adapt.
That's amazing.
I love it.
Jan, thanks so much for joining us today. And guys, I also want to mention this. If you'd like to listen to more of Jan talking, he's got a kick-ass podcast, the Leadership Podcast. He does a great job with that. Also, please do check out his upcoming book, Becoming a Self-Reliant Leader. Talking about pride here, I'm proud of you. I'm just going to say it as your friend. I'm proud of you, buddy. Writing a book is darn hard. You and Jacquie have done an incredible job, especially taking all of these lessons learned from 24 crucibles, distilling them down into wisdom that can be shared and distributed out into the world so that people can do great things and go home good tired. I can't think of a better thing to do than to buy your book, read your book, check in with Jan at his podcast. And with that, we will see you guys next time on the Applied Leadership Podcast. As always, please send your questions to contact@appliedleadershippartners.com. And thanks a ton for listening.